So the first thing I'm doing here is naturally opening the computer. So the first thing we need to do is to remove those 6 screws that we have on the bottom. And I want to make sure that I put them on separate places so I know which goes where. It's very important that you do that because the size of the screws are different. So after removing the screws, I'm using this tool here to lift this back cover while I use another tool to pry all around it in order to try and pull it towards me and then freeing it up. So after removing this back cover, we're going to start undoing all the connectors that we have to the main board PCB or the motherboard PCB. And then after that, we're going to start unscrewing everything that needs to be taken out before we can remove the motherboard. And the first thing that I'm disconnecting there is the battery connector and this little protection that goes right on top of it. And you'll notice that you also need to unscrew this larger screw on top of that contact there and lift it up so that the battery is disconnected. Make sure that you keep all the screws and the components that you are removing grouped together in a place that you can look for them later so you don't get screws mixed up and whatnot. So here I continue unscrewing this bracket and this connector that I believe is also part of the battery connector, but I'm not sure. Another nice tip is to use those plastic spludges. I think that's the name of those. They do really help a lot when removing those connectors. Next up, I'm gonna remove this speaker and its connector. This is one of those where you need to lift this tab and then unscrew the speaker and then remove the connector. And then here I'm doing the same thing for the other speaker, lifting up the tab, unscrewing and then disconnecting. After that, it's time to disconnect the keyboard connector here. And next we need to lift this thing and pull out the SSD. Now let's remove this bracket on the top left corner and make sure that you keep those tiny screws on a safe place. Let's now focus on removing those 2 brackets here on the display connector. Alright, so the next thing to remove here is those connector adapters, and make sure that you're extra careful because this is what broke and the reason why we're going through this fix. So after that, what I'm removing here is this bracket that I am assuming connects the fan maybe, not sure. Alright, so at this point we removed all the connectors. Now we start removing the screws for the motherboard itself. And I like to keep them on the same pattern that you have on the motherboard itself, just because those screws have different sizes. So it's really important that you put them back exactly where they were. So now I put the computer aside and I'm working solely on the PCB. And you can see the damage that I've made here. Basically the ring outside the antenna connector got detached and it's now stuck on the connector that goes to the cable. So my strategy here was to try to use my tweezers as leverage since I did have this piece that is sticking out. And you can see that eventually I managed to take it out. So after removing that leftover piece, I start taking a look to see if the connector looks good. And as you can see here, they look exactly the same. So that's some good news. Alright, so here you can see the damage that we caused to the connector there. You can see clearly that the ring is missing. So the next thing I need to do is to try and remove this leftover piece here before I try to reattach a new connector. So here is the replacement connector, and at this point I'm just making sure that they look the same, which apparently they do. And this is where the removal nightmare starts. I apply some flux first in order to try and heat this up and finally remove the connector. So here I started to apply some hot air, and then I remembered that this is unleaded solder, so I stop and I start applying some leaded solder to hopefully bring the melting point a little bit down so I can remove it easier. Now back to the hot air, and this time I managed to take the connector out. So after that, I am now trying to remove the excess solder there with a wick. And as you can see, either because my tip is too small or because I didn't apply enough heat on the soldering iron, the wick ended up being stuck. If this ends up happening to you, I learned the hard way that what you should do is stay calm and never try to pull the wick or force it out, because you're going to end up ripping the pads. So what I do here is I go back to the soldering iron, I try to increase the temperature and slowly make my way out and take the wick out. And then I go back to the wick, and you can see that I end up getting stuck again. So in hindsight, I should have used a larger tip as well. But in the end, I managed to take it out, and I think the pads look good for us to try and put the connector back. So I go ahead and start cleaning the pad, trying to make it as good as it's gonna get for the resoldering. So back with a little more flux, and let's go back to the hot air station and try to make this and try to melt this solder so that we can reconnect the adapter. And then I go through all this trouble just to have the connector loose again. So I go back and I start it over again, and finally it looks a little crooked, but I'm okay with that. So I take out the multimeter and I start probing to make sure that, the pads are not shorting together. And finally I figured that this is as good as it's gonna get, and we move on. So one last cleaning and one last inspection from different angles, and I think we're ready to reassemble the PCB. Alright, so I'm not gonna bother you with the reassembling process because it's basically the disassemble process in reverse. So I'm gonna speed through this until the point where I start putting the back cover on and testing the computer. Alright, so time for the truth. Do you guys think it's gonna work? Put in the comments below if you think this is gonna work first try or not. So yeah, if you said it wouldn't work first time, you were right. Everything do work except the keyboard. So I go back and I disassemble. And eventually I find that I left the little tab on the keyboard connector open. So this time I was smart and I left the back cover out and I test and the keyboard works. So back to reassembling and that's it, right? Well, no, look what I left out. Well, you know what they say, third time is the charm, right? So for the third time, I go back, I open it up, I put the missing thingy and I reassemble it. And now let's go back to the final testing. So the problem that I was having is that the Bluetooth was not working because of that broken antenna connector. So I'll see if it works now. And there we have it. It seems like it connected super fast. Let me see if I can. Let me change my device to these Mobius. I think I changed the Bluetooth to use the external dongle that I was trying to use while the thing was broken. So let me see how to revert that. To revert the behavior, you delete this thing from the NVRAM apparently. Let me make this super large so you guys can see. So this is the command that you use for that. So and then you reboot. So I'm gonna put my headset here in pairing mode. So now it's pairing. Let's see if it appears here. There we go. It says paired. It did say that. Here, let me change the audio. It's already there. So let me open something like Spotify. Which I don't have. Let me go to YouTube. Yep, it's definitely working. Let me show you guys. And we are basically picking off where we left off yesterday. And before we start, I don't know if we have enough people. All right, so mission accomplished. There we go.